Hello, and welcome to the Physical Preparation Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Robertson, and today we're going to be doing our Q1 2025 Q&A episode. So first and foremost, thank you so much for tuning in. Really appreciate it. Second, I can't say this strongly enough. Man, thank you to everyone who chimed in and had a fantastic question to contribute to this show. I was absolutely floored. I think before, when I've done these, a lot of times I'll put it on IG, and sometimes the questions are kind of hard to understand. You don't always know who's going to see your stuff on IG. So doing an email blast, man, I got some really fantastic questions, and I'm really excited to do this show. I think as I tried to lay it out, there were some similar themes or topics. For instance, I got quite a few questions about in-season programming. So we're going to cover that kind of in one section. There's another area that's all about Gen Pop training. So I've tried to group this as best as possible. There's a couple standalone one-off questions, but overall, a ton of ground to cover. So here's like a little breakdown in order so you kind of know what to expect. Number one, we're going to talk about in-season training because I got a couple questions on that topic. Second, force plate testing. We're going to talk about increasing income. What if you're already doing 40-ish hours a week and you don't want to take on more clients? How do you bump up your pay? We're going to talk about the concepts of braking and propulsion, something you're going to hear me talking more and more about in the months and years to come. Again, big section on Gen Pop training. We're going to talk about plyometrics. We're going to talk about strength. We're going to talk about rotating their emphasis over the course of a training year. So big section if you train Gen Pop clients that I think will help. We're going to talk about progressing movements, how to know when somebody can move from A to B to C. We're going to talk about just evolving your program design. We're going to talk about my thoughts on accessory lifts. How much should you load them? How much of an emphasis should they have? And last but not least, I saved this one because I think it's going to be a good one to end on, a little bit of motivation for you. But this idea of staying motivated as a trainer or coach, if you're not in the best environment, maybe you don't have other coaches around you that are really passionate or excited about their craft, how can you find ways to keep yourself intellectually switched on and stimulated? So as you go through this, again, I would listen to it probably once, and then if there's a relevant topic, go back, listen to it again, take some notes. There's also going to be a ton of show notes here because I'm going to mention, different products, different podcasts, some videos that I think are all relevant. So make sure you take a look at the show notes. There may be some things that I'm going to plug shamelessly, like products I've already created that take deeper dives into some of these topics. So they may be relevant to you. So make sure you go back, check out the show notes because there's going to be a ton in there. But all in all, super excited to do this. So we're going to take a quick break and then we'll jump into this week's Q&A episode. All right, my friend, let's do this. So we're going to start with Anestis. And Anestis and Paul both have questions about in-season training. So Anestis says, hello, I would like to ask about weight training sessions in season with a busy schedule. Say you're playing 2 games per week, for example. How can I deal with it? And how can I keep the strength of my players up? So again, I told you there's going to be some shameless plugs. There is already a standalone product you can buy. It's on my website on the products page, but it's just called In-Season Programming for Basketball. Now, even if you don't train basketball players, I will tell you the concepts that I talk about in there, the strategies I outline are exactly what I do when I write an in-season program. So this is relevant and applicable to any sport that you work with. Now, again, there's a slant on it because I talk a lot about basketball. And if you're a member of IBI, you've seen this as well. But I created it as a standalone product because I think a lot of people have questions about this. And so I think what you need to start doing, there's a couple different types of training days that I have, right? But the most important thing you have to think about when you're writing an in-season program is you have to account for the games first. And I know that sounds simple and incredibly mundane, but we have to say it because as I've done more and more in-season programming, and more of my athletes have come to me because they don't feel like they're getting served well with their strength coaches. It's because these strength coaches are trying to insert themselves and make themselves the star of the show. It's not the case, right? If you're an athlete, your job is to be at your best on game day. That's the day that matters most. So when you're laying out an in-season program, you start by figuring out when are the training days, when are the competition days, and then finding those gaps in between. Right? If you're playing, say, Saturday, Wednesday, maybe on Monday, you can sneak in a workout to some degree. Maybe you got to wait until like a Tuesday, and it's got to be more of what I would describe as a stim day. So you're not training super heavy, but hey, you can get in the gym, you can move around a little bit, recapture some range of motion, and just get your athletes feeling good. So you got to think about this. Where can you sneak training in? Now, here's another way to think about it. Can you even get them to get one good training day per week? And so when I'm laying out an in-season program, I might look at an entire month and I might say, oh man, this week's really busy. This week's really busy, but this week we only play one game. And so maybe, those first 2 weeks, I'm just trying to get a little bit of work in, maybe a little bit of maintenance, make sure they're continuing to feel good. But then on that third or that fourth week, maybe they don't play quite as much and we can sneak some more training in those weeks. So don't get caught up just in the week to week. You got to think on a little bit more macro scale over the course of, say, 4, 6, 8 weeks. Are there certain times where they're not playing as often where you can sneak that training in? Now, there is an element of what I would describe as selling psychology here. Okay. And so part of it is the implication that we train in season. And this is super important. So if you're in a private sector setting, you know what happens. A lot of times you got your athletes for, whatever their off season is, 2-3 months, and then it's a ghost town and you don't hear from them for 3 or 4 months. And so one thing that we did at iFast, and one thing that I've always kind of implied with my athletes, is that there is off-season training and there is in-season training. And so we would actually label our training packages as such. So we would have off-season training packages that were 2, 3, 4 times per week. Now, what am I implying here? You got to train at least twice a week if you want to get better. If you are off-season and you're only seeing me once a week, that's not a real off-season program. Okay, there is an implied message there that once a week isn't enough. You need to be in here 2, 3, maybe even 4 times a week, depending on what level you're trying to be at. Now, on the flip side of this, we had our off-season packages. We also had our in-season packages. And so those were 1 to 2 times per week. So again, we're implying that, hey, you don't stop training just because you move into your season. You're merely shifting from off-season to in-season training. And this is where you can have a great discussion with the athlete, with the coach, with the parent, whoever's involved. And you just let them know, hey, look, we just spent all this time developing these physical qualities. Why would we want to let it go? Okay, so you want to imply that there's off-season training and there's in-season training. And then the final piece here is, if you literally cannot train, let's say it's an incredibly dense schedule. And I know some of my guys that are playing overseas, there are times it looks like an NBA calendar where they're literally playing every other day. And so the times to load are very few and very far between. So if I had an athlete like that and they're in my space, I'm just trying to sell them on recovery. Hey, look, I know you're going to feel beat up. Can you come in and work with me? Let's spend 30, 45 minutes. Let's just try and, get your ankles loosened up, get your knees, your hips, your back, get your body feeling right. Maybe we'll do some long duration isos. We'll do some Spanish squats. We'll get on the roller. Let's just try and get you feeling good so that the next time you go out there and play, you're feeling a little bit better. So Anestis, really hope that helps you out. And I think it's going to piggyback really well with my next question, which comes from Paul. And so Paul says, my biggest struggle is getting middle and high school kids to find or make the time to train strength and speed. Too many are too busy, in air quotes, if you're not watching, too busy to train outside of sport. Please explain why they should train and what's in it for them. So first and foremost, I would refer you back to the previous question and the selling psychology part of this, right? Implying that there is an off-season period where you're taking time to do 2 things. Your off-season should really do 2 things. One, it should give you time to work on your body. And second, it should give you time to work on your game. All right. The second you get in season, the coach is focused on team development, team tactics, team strategies. It's very hard to get your individual work in. Okay. Maybe some sports it may be a little bit easier, like baseball or something like that. But in something like, say, basketball or soccer, it's really hard to get your individual work in because there's such an emphasis on team development. So when the off season hits, you got to let them know, hey, we're focusing on your body. We're focusing on your game. When the in season hits, now we're focused on, as strength coaches or physical preparation coaches, it's our job to make sure we maintain your physical qualities as long as we can. Because look, nobody wants you to be the best player at the start of the year and then just peter off, right? And I think we see this far too often. A kid just grinds, and let's say it's high school basketball. October, November, man, they look fresh and they look bouncy and they look fit. And then by the time March comes around and it's sectionals and they really need you to play at a high level, and you don't have any more juice. Okay. So one thing that I'll try and do to help coaches, parents, kids understand this is that, hey, look, like if you're training for a sport, you wouldn't just stop training that sport for 3, 6, 9 months at a time. Right. So if you're a basketball player, you wouldn't go 3, 6, 9 months without touching a basketball. So why would you do that when it comes to your physical development? Why would you just step away and say, oh, no, I'm good. I'm not going to touch this for the next 3 to 6 months. It makes absolutely no sense because if you don't touch a basketball or you never get on a soccer ball or you never throw a baseball, if you're not doing these things regularly, you lose those skills. Well, the same thing applies to especially speed and strength, right? I think the retaining quality or the retaining length of time for max speed is like 5 days plus or minus 3 days. So somewhere between 2 and 8 days, you start to lose max speed. So go read, I think it was Vladimir Isherin in his block periodization books. He talks about like these physical adaptations and how long they take to deteriorate. But yeah, I mean, speed goes away incredibly quickly. So if you're not training that in your sport, you got to be training it outside of your sport. So one other thing I'll kind of wrap up with here, Paul, because I think this is really helpful. Let's say you're working with a broad mix of kids, and I don't know much about your facility or your environment, but I remember Eric Cressy telling me this story because I asked the same thing to him. It was either on a podcast or in person. We were having a chat one time, and I just said, look, dude, how did you really get people to commit to in-season training? And he said, look, here's what happened. He had the team that he worked with, a high school team, and he got a couple kids in. And then over time, like he basically had the whole team in. But then he had the same issue where maybe it was the first or second year they worked together. He'd have the whole team in the off season and then like nobody in season. And so what ended up happening, he had 1 or 2 kids and they kind of just bucked the norm and they started training off season and in season. And so what ended up happening the next year, after these guys had been training year round for an entire season, those 2 guys started hitting bombs. And then all of a sudden, now the parents and the coaches are like, well, what did those guys do different? Eric's like, well, they didn't stop training. They trained in season year round. And now you're seeing the benefits because ultimately what happens if somebody has a great off season and then they do nothing, they lose most of it. And so it's just this, back and forth sawtooth up and down over the course of a year versus, hey man, build your physical qualities. You're probably going to lose a little bit in season. That's fine. But as long as you hang on for dear life and you maintain as much as you can, think about where you're starting your next off season. Okay. So the goal is to lose as little as possible when you're in season so that when you start your next off season training cycle, you're building and starting from a much higher point. So Anestis, Paul, I hope those questions help you out. I'm obviously passionate about in-season training, but if you have follow-ups, let me know. Next, we have a question from Matthew. Matthew wants to know, how have I leveraged force plate testing, specifically jump tests and isometrics, to improve the training process? A little bit further, he asked, any key metrics you have looked at in either and how it helps inform your decision-making process would be extremely helpful. So this is a super loaded question, Matthew. I feel like I could probably do an entire podcast episode just on this. And hopefully when I can get Drake back on soon, we'll dive into some of these in a little bit more depth because I know he's got a lot going on, but I think we would have a really good discussion. So be on the lookout for that soon. But let me just start with something that, again, may not be on people's radar. But one of the things I try and explain to facility owners or people that are looking at buying force plates, if you want to sell somebody on your training, you could be an awful coach. But if somebody walks in and you have force plates and you've got like the TV screen in front, and on day one, you can take little Johnny through a jump testing profile or a strength testing profile, dude, they can't give you their money fast enough. It's actually quite crazy. It's a very expensive lead magnet, but I think of it as, hey man, this is something that not only sells people almost immediately, but the back end of it, being able to assess, being able to track, has been an absolute game changer for me. So the wow factor alone is awesome. And then the other piece of this is a lot of times when an athlete comes in, If they're a younger athlete, sometimes it's the parents that's telling me this. Sometimes it's the kid themselves, or definitely when it gets to older athletes. A lot of times athletes come in and they can tell you, hey, I'm just not super fast, or I'm not jumping very high. Okay. And these are things we could probably tell you on our own, right? We don't need fancy tech or fancy gadgets. But the fact that they tell me I don't jump very high, and then I can take them, warm them up, take them through my assessment process. We put them on force plates, and then I can compare them to maybe it's other high school kids. Maybe they want to play Division I, or they have dreams of playing professionally. So now I can take that vertical jump and I can compare them against another population. This is absolutely huge because I can show them, look, you are absolutely right. You are not jumping high enough. You want to play Division I basketball. Here's where I need you to be. All of your scores are average or poor. I need you at least in this upper band, right? I need you above average. So the selling process of this is huge. Now, you asked specifically about tests. So let's talk about tests. The primary tests I'm using right now, right? Unless there's a specific case or application I'm trying to tease out, I'm looking at a counter movement jump, bilateral. I'm looking at a counter movement rebound jump. A lot of times I'm going to use a single leg CMJ, and then I'm typically going to try and do some form of isometric testing. Could be an isometric belt squat. The setup I have now, I don't love for that because I have to tear all the foam apart, and it's just kind of a hassle. So it's generally going to be like an isometric mid-thigh pull, just something to get general lower body force development. And then if somebody is coming off any sort of injury, I may do some specific isolated strength testing with the true strength. So that's kind of the battery of tests. And one of the things that I've tried to do is infuse and use technology without taking away from all the other things that I feel like I bring to the table. And so, even though I talk a lot about force plate testing, that might only be 5 to 10 minutes of my actual assessment process, because I'm not going to get away from, hey, the Q&A up top is super important. The movement screen that I'm going to take people through, whether it's actually watching them do sport-specific movements, whether it's watching them squat, split squat, hinge, push-up, all those things are critically important. So those are the tests, right? And I know it doesn't sound like a lot because it's not. I don't want that to be the only thing that I do. But those are the tests. And then as far as some of the metrics I use go, number one, I love jump height. I know that's why everybody buys force plates, I think, initially, because you want a better representation of jump height. And then very quickly you realize, hey, this is a great tool and a great metric, but then there's so much other cool stuff behind it. I think eventually most of us just kind of it's cool to see somebody's jump height go up, but there's so many other metrics to look at and chase and potentially track that are valuable. So I'll look at jump height. I love CMJ depth, which I think is a great indicator of somebody moving more effectively, or maybe recapturing their center of gravity, which we'll talk about here later. But I think CMJ depth is an interesting one. I think eccentric braking is one that I'm always looking at, and eccentric braking RFD specifically, because a lot of times somebody doesn't have great brakes. They're not going to be able to just turn it off and on, or I'll find an asymmetry in their eccentric braking between their right and left leg. And so these things are just way more sensitive. Yeah, you can watch somebody squat, maybe they shift to one side or another. But when you can see somebody's force time curve in real time, and you can see somebody where one leg is doing all of the work and then the other leg is doing like nothing, it's very clear, because you can show that athlete, hey, look, you're not where you need to be yet. Because you got to think, a lot of the athletes I get have lingering stuff, or they've been playing their sport long enough, they have stuff going on. So if I can identify that and help them kind of tease or clean up some of those things over time, then I'm doing them a real service. So eccentric braking RFD, eccentric peak velocity. That's another one. I stole that one from Daniel Martinez. I don't know if we talked about it specifically on our podcast, but one of the things he talked about was trying to get a lot of his volleyball players to -2 meters per second. And if you've seen somebody move at -2 meters per second coming down, they're hollow. But in theory, if they can slam on the brakes and they can redirect all of that energy, so taking it and reversing it and slingshotting themselves back up, they're probably going to jump higher. So I like that. Left-right braking RFD. And then another one that I really like are landing forces left to right. So looking at that asymmetry, when they land in between the first and second jumps of a CMJ rebound. Because what I found is a lot of times you could do a squat jump, you can do a CMJ, and some of the asymmetries don't show up. But when somebody jumps maximally on the first jump and then they land, so when they're on that rebound or second jump, that's where you're going to see some of these landing asymmetries, the braking asymmetries. And so that's where you can start to tease out, okay, hey, this is something we need to have on our radar. So those are the tests. Those are the metrics. Then I think it really comes down to how are you using it? So when I'm using this, I'm starting with an assessment, right? Obviously, we're doing all the movement stuff, all the things we've already talked about. But once I've gone through that assessment, then I'm setting KPIs. And again, maybe early in a program, I'm just looking at, let's say somebody's really stiff and they're really locked up. They're really far forward. If they're in that position, they're not going to have great CMJ depth. So I'm going to just track CMJ depth for a couple weeks and just see if we can start to unlock their body a little bit. Generally, after that first block, then we'll get more specific. So then maybe we're chasing something like jump height, like eccentric braking, eccentric velocity, things of that nature. But it's assessment, set KPIs. Then once I've done that, put the program in place, right? So I've determined, hey, these are the things I want to focus on. So now I write a program that should emphasize those. And then the final piece is weekly testing and a weekly review. So every Monday, if somebody's on plates regularly, I'm going to test them on Monday. And then Monday afternoon, I come in here and I just nerd out on my computer for about an hour. And I'm just tracking to see, hey, if we're tracking an asymmetry, is that improving? If we're tracking something like eccentric velocity, is that improving? So that's kind of the process that I'm using. I've got a great example actually in iFast Basketball Insiders now that I just posted. It's a breaking case study. And so this particular athlete I work with, he's probably not going to be, like this high flyer dunking all over dudes, but he's a high level pro. And so we basically made breaking the emphasis of his program. So I basically break down what breaking is, why it's important. We talk about the specific exercises and the exact program that I use. And then I do like a little review as far as the different metrics and stuff. So if that's of interest to you, you can definitely check that out. That's at ifastbasketballinsiders.com, and you can get started for $7. So Matthew, that was a long-winded answer, but I hope it helped. Next, we have Danny. Danny wants to know, are there any strategies you would recommend to a personal trainer or strength coach wanting to make more income without performing more in-person hours? He says right now he's currently doing 40 sessions and living near a metropolitan city. Cost of living is pretty high along with other expenditures, and he loves the podcast, especially the solo shows on all the things. So Danny, first off, truly appreciate that, man. That means a lot. I do take a lot of time in these, and I want to make sure there's a lot of value. So I appreciate the kind words. Now, to your point, I think you have a couple options here. And when I was outlining this, at first I thought there's two options, but you really have three options. Okay. So the three options are, number one, you can raise your hourly rate. Number two, you can use session leverage, i.e. you can do more group or semi-private stuff. Or three, which is kind of off of the training grid, which is doing online coaching. Okay, so let's talk about increasing rates first. I am a big believer that most of us have at least a 5 to 10% bump in income available to us at almost any time without losing clients. And that is simply by raising our rates. And this is something I've made this mistake a couple times in my career. For some reason, it's one of those lessons, sometimes you got to learn it a couple times, right? Not always the brightest guy. So sometimes I have to learn this a couple times. But I learned it at iFast, right? Because there was a time where we kept our rates the same like forever. And then we had to have the great reset. And then, now we've got it with our trainers. I've done it with my basketball stuff a little bit to where now I'm just baking in, hey, every year we're going to reevaluate and probably raise rates, right? And I think that's fair. In this day and age, everything goes up, right? Everything from the cost of your facility to your insurance to the services that you're offering. Like, you should be a better coach year over year over year. So you deserve to get a raise every year. So that would be number one. And that might be the easiest thing. Just across the board, say, hey, my rates are going up. And then the second part of that discussion is you let them know, hey, look, if it's been a while, there's going to be a course correct. And maybe it's a little bit steeper raise. but then I just write it into basically all my paperwork now. Like, hey, look, we're going to reset the price. This is what it is. And then every year, there's probably going to be a small bump. And so that way it's just set. It's an expectation that people know, and they're, probably a lot less likely to complain about it. Now, you might lose one or two people, but I'm also a believer that anytime those types of people leave, that just opens or creates a space for a better client that does value your time. Okay, so number one, raise your rates. Number two, let's talk about session leverage. So semi-private, obviously, I'm sure you've heard of that. You've been doing this for a while now, but basically it's the same hour, but I think you can command anywhere from 20 to 50% more for that hour. So if we just used easy money, let's say you're charging $100 for a private. I think you could easily charge somewhere between $60 and $70 an hour for a semi-private. So that's where I'd be asking, hey, do you have a husband and wife that want to train together? Do you have somebody that you really enjoy working with and they want to start bringing their friend? Maybe you just have people that want to get on your schedule or they want to work with you, but they don't have the funds to work privately one-on-one for a session. So these are things that I would be thinking about. And that's kind of what I'm doing, with the basketball stuff, because everybody makes different amounts of money, right? Like the longer I do this, everybody thinks everybody's at the NBA and they're making NBA money, but not everybody's making NBA money. And so with that being the case, I want to have a couple different options in the sense of I want a one-on-one, right? So if somebody wants private, I don't mind private, right? Because I know I can give them my full time, my full attention. I'm locked in on their programming. I'm giving them all the cues that I feel like they need to be successful. So I don't mind it, right? But that's me and that's my preference. So I don't mind that. I'll do semi-private. And when I say semi-private, literally it's like 2 at a time. And so that's obviously a little bit of a discounted rate. And then now I'm just doing what I call group. And I'm trying to kind of keep that to like 1 or 2 sessions. Because again, not everybody's on crazy, high 6-figure, 7-figure salaries. So I want to be available to some of these guys because I know that at the risk of sounding conceited or arrogant, and I don't want to come across as that, but I think some of these athletes would really be in trouble if I wasn't working with them, because I can do things for them to keep their body right that's going to extend or maximize their career. And so that's just me being me. If you're making, a low amount of money, I can't charge you, what I would charge an NBA player for one-on-one. So again, that's just me trying to give back. And I feel like that's something that's important to me. But that's what I would be doing. If I were you, I'd be thinking about session leverage as my second point. Now, your third option here, Danny, is online coaching. And so this is where maybe you got to tap in to a little bit different part of, like what you're doing and how you work with people. But I'd start thinking about whenever people talk about online coaching, they ask, well, how do I do it? Right? The X's and O's. And I think that's easy, right? I don't think you have to change all that much. You could go to an online platform like Train Heroic, which I think is a fantastic option. But if you're just getting started and you're just dipping your toe in the water, hey man, just write it in Word, write it in Excel to start. Right. And then if this piece of your business grows, then it's absolutely time to invest in something like Train Heroic, and shameless plug for them because they're awesome. But this is where people either question, how do I do it? Or how do I find clients? And so when it comes to finding clients, I'd start thinking about, do you have old clients, right? Who maybe don't come to the gym anymore. And maybe it wasn't like a bad thing, right? They just don't want to make the commute. Or maybe people that moved away, people that are friends of friends that maybe don't like their coach, but they're not willing to come to you, right? For whatever reason. I'd start thinking about extending and growing your business maybe in that direction, because, kind of based on the way your question sounds, it sounds like this is something that may be of interest to you. But the great thing about online coaching is you kind of break this connection between this set hour and this amount of money, right? So like if I'm doing a private session, I have to be there at 9 a.m. on Monday morning, or I don't get that money, right? Versus if I do online coaching, as long as I get the program to the client, on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, whenever it's promised, I can write that program whenever I want. There's asynchronicity to it. And so I think that's a really powerful thing. Now, just know and understand, the second you decide to go off on this tangent, there's going to be work involved. Right? It's not like you snap your fingers and immediately you have this robust client base and you know everything that you're doing and it's a smooth, well-oiled machine. It takes time. But if that's something you're interested in, that is something that can help you kind of break or untether that time and dollar amount connection and make it a little bit more asynchronous. And that way you can kind of set your own schedule and work on those things in pockets of time that work well for you. So, Danny, again, kind of a longer answer there, but I hope that was helpful for you. Next, my guy, Patrick. Man, Patrick, thanks for this, dude. I appreciate it. So Patrick wants to know, he said, Mike, you talk about braking and building a good set of brakes. What does that mean in strength training terms? What sort of exercises build braking and how do they do it? And why is braking important for a general population client, or is it important to them? Okay, so first off, for context, Patrick is an online client. He also attended Joel and I's workshop in Vegas, which is where I started talking about this. And I'm going to be talking about this idea of braking versus propulsion in more and more depth, because I think everything that we do from a movement perspective can be looked at through this lens. And I think it's a description that works well because there's science behind it, right? They're using this terminology in science and in scientific research. But I think it also is just really intuitive. People understand that in every movement, right? Whether we're talking about a squat, whether we're talking about a split squat, whether we're talking about walking or jogging, there is a braking and there is a propulsive phase. Now, there's a guy, I believe it is Damian Harper, who is kind of like the go-to guy in this realm. And to be honest, I haven't read a ton of his stuff. I've read enough to familiarize myself, but I'm very much in this phase of I don't want to think exactly like him because I have my own thoughts here and I want to let them kind of cultivate and marinate first before I dive in and kind of immerse myself in what he's doing. But when I think about braking, there's really two elements here. There is getting into a position to brake, and then there is having the physical ability to brake. So here's what I mean by that. And if you're listening, my apologies. I'll do my best to describe it, but here's where a video would help. When we're talking about braking and propulsion, if you imagine looking at somebody's posture from the side, right? They should have this like plumb line where it's like ankle, knee, hip, shoulder, back of the ear in a nice straight line, and they're perpendicular to the ground. This is where somebody should be resting. Now, do enough posture photos and you realize almost nobody looks like that. Almost everybody is pushed forward to some degree, right? And so what this allows them to do, it allows them to propulse easier, right? It's like you're kind of falling forward. Now, this can be advantageous in sports, in certain areas of life, and because at the end of the day, the goal is to move forward, right? Like if we go back thousands of years, you had to be able to breathe, right? You got to be able to move. And one of the ways that makes movement easier is falling forward. Now, here's the downside to this. Over time, what was once advantageous, right? You get far enough forward and now it becomes a limiter, right? Because what happens is you get on this ski slope, and that's the way I describe it. Like if you imagine like standing up tall and then shifting your weight forward, like onto your toes, but keeping your heels on the ground, it's like standing on a ski slope. And if you want to try this, it's a great little tool to see what this does to you. So go ahead, stand up if you can. Lean your body weight forward so your weight is more over your toes, but your heels are still on the ground. Now, keep your heels on the ground and try and squat down as low as you can. And if you can't try it, I'll tell you how it goes. It's not going to go well. You're not going to be able to squat very low, okay? Because when we're too far forward, we lose our ability to change levels, to rotate, and to brake. We are stuck in a propulsive position, okay? So the first thing I'm chasing is this ability to brake, right? I'm trying to shift somebody's center of gravity back, right? So we talked about two things. There's position and there's ability to brake. I want to chase position first. So I need to shift somebody back. And in a lot of cases, or in most cases, that involves opening up the backside of their body. It could be, the area in between their shoulder blades. It could be their lower back. It could be their glute area, right? But if somebody's very stiff and rigid, like if I squeezed all the muscles on the backside of your body, right? So again, you can stand up and try this. Imagine squeezing your glutes and arching your back hard and pinning your shoulder blades back together. It puts you in this propulsive position and it limits your ability to brake. So when I'm starting to train somebody, I want to open up the backside of the body and I want to shift them back so they're in a more balanced position. Okay? So just remember, we need to learn how to shift our center of gravity back So we not only unlock our mobility, but we also distribute forces more effectively. So I think a lot of people, especially people that, 50s, 60s, 70s, and they're having knee replacements, they're having hip replacements, they've been stuck in this propulsive position for so long, right? And now they're just wearing down certain joint surfaces, right? They're wearing down their patellofemoral joints or the front of their knee joints or the front of their hip, right? Because they've lost that ability to shift back, unlock their body, and rotate effectively. Okay, so that's the first point. That's why breaking position is important. And I'm going to be talking more and more about this. I've got some articles I think that I'm going to write that'll be helpful. But position is number one. The second piece, and this is where, is it valuable? It depends, but this ability to break, right? And generally when we think of breaking, we think of stopping quickly. And there is relevance here to Gen Pop clients. So I know a lot of my Gen Pop clients like to do things outside of the weight room, right? One guy plays beach tennis. Another gal plays real tennis. I know people that play pickleball. They play golf. So if you have people that want to play rec sports, right? Maybe even pick up basketball, then you need to train the actual ability of breaking. Okay. And this is where I think there's two parts to it. Position first, right? And I've talked about this for years. Shift center of gravity back, get somebody stacked more effectively. And then the second piece there is, now can they train the breaks? And that's where maybe you're doing some of these rapid stops and starts, right? So instead of just doing a goblet squat, you're doing a goblet squat and you're dropping quick and sticking, right? Or if you're doing a push-up, instead of just doing a regular standard push-up, you're starting in the top of that push-up position and then you drop quick and you stick. So these types of things I think are really beneficial. And it's where a lot of people miss the boat. When we're focused on strength, and it's strength, 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 we're focused on, again, a lot of times these propulsive capacities, and we're not focused on the physical act of breaking. So Patrick, that was a pretty loaded question, but I hope I did a good enough job of explaining why it's important, right? We need the position, and then we need the physical ability. If you're going to play sports, breaking, right, and moving from an eccentric to a concentric type position is incredibly important, because that's what sports are, right? It's being able to absorb and store energy and then release energy. So if you're going to do that in high level sports, whatever that means to you, then you need to be training it in the gym, because that's what's going to prepare you for staying healthy. Okay. So Patrick, great question, man. And I hope that helped. Next, we have the three-parter here. So if you're talking about Gen Pop people, you're interested in Gen Pop, this is a section for you. So we got Matthew, Alessandro, and Nils. We'll start with Matthew. Matthew says, for someone 40 plus years old that wants to rebuild some athleticism, where would you typically start them with plyometrics, and what are some KPIs you're looking to hit? Okay. And then I'm just going to read all these. So then we have Alessandro, and Alessandro, says, training for longevity. How do you organize your training to kind of cover all the bases with the minimum effective dose? And how might some variables change, like reps in the tank, as you age? He also goes on and asks, does periodization really matter for a general population client? How do you suggest it with a non-athlete population? Then last but not least, we have Nils. And Nils says, with regards to 40-plus-year-old weekend warriors and Gen Pop folks like myself, how strong is strong enough? Do you have any standards regarding strength in the lower body and upper body movements? And he goes on to say, always enjoy listening to your podcast. So first off, gentlemen, thank you. These are great questions. And man, it's a topic I'm really excited to talk about. I love talking about athletes, but I love talking about longevity and weekend warriors, because this is where I fall. And this is the bulk of my online clients these days. Again, they're not interested in just getting crazy huge or crazy strong. They want to be able to move and feel good and age gracefully. So let's start with the plyos. Okay, so we'll start with Matthew's question. And I'm going to lead with an unpopular opinion. If you are going to chase plyometrics and you're going to do a lot of these plyometric type activities, the first thing you need to chase is body comp. And here's why I say that. If you follow Jake Tura and all of the great tendon research that's coming out these days, everybody will tell you across the board, one of the biggest indicators of tendon health is obesity and metabolic health. So if somebody is massively overweight, chances are their tendons are going to be in horrible shape. So first things first, if you want to get somebody to be able to do plyometrics, I'd be chasing body comp right out of the gate. Now, not saying that's all you would do, because I think you can start filling in some of these gaps. What I tend to do when I'm thinking about a weekend warrior or maybe an athlete coming off an injury is that there's two ends to the spectrum. Okay, so you got your high force isolation exercises. So if we're using a calf Achilles complex, doesn't have to be crazy or exotic. I'm doing a seated calf raise and I'm doing a standing calf raise, and I'm trying to load that sucker up. I'm targeting a very specific tissue. Maybe I'm doing some tempo-based stuff, so I'm putting them on a metronome, but I'm isolating those targeted tissues because that's what's going to prep them for the quicker, more ballistic plyometric type activities. So I'm going to start with the slow, heavy stuff first. Second, then I'm going to get into my low amplitude ballistics. And so again, a lot of times people think when we start talking about plyos, they're thinking about crazy like box jumps and, jumping repeatedly over hurdles. No, I'm starting like jumping rope, very basic, very easy. And sometimes that might not even be enough assistance, right? Because let's say somebody is a little bit overweight. Maybe I'm going to start with band assisted plyos first, like band assisted mini jumps. And I believe I have a video on this that I'll post from YouTube, but it's just a little series that I use band assistance, right? Pull the band down to your chest, and then I'll do different jumps, right? So maybe it's pogos, maybe it's in and outs, maybe it's scissors, but just putting the calf and the Achilles in these different positions. And so that's where I would kind of start. It looks super easy. For a lot of us, you're probably like, yeah, that's just common sense, but that's where I'd be starting. And then I'd start progressing into maybe box jump variations and that sort of thing. Because the great thing about a box jump, obviously you jump up, you can control the height, but you also you also control the landing forces. So that's the big thing. If you're just jumping in place and you jump 18 inches, well, you're also coming down and crashing down. You got to be able to absorb 18 inches worth of force. So that's where box jumps are a great place to start, just those one-off expressions of power, and then you kind of build up from there. So maybe not KPIs per se, but that's where I would start. Now, the next question was about periodization. And I actually did an entire masterclass on this. Again, it's on the product section of the website where it's just Gen Pop program design. But R7, let's just start with R7. So if you're unfamiliar with the concept, R7 is the system that I use to write programs for everybody. Gen Pop clients, young athletes, old athletes, retired people, doesn't matter. R7 is the game plan. And so the seven R's are release, reset, readiness, reactive, resistance, resiliency, and recovery. So it's everything from your foam rolling in your warm up to any speed, power, jumping type training, your strength work, your metabolic and your conditioning work, down to your recovery. But if you want to touch all these bases, you need to use a system like this because it's going to literally walk you through the entire process. So one of the things that I try and do with my Gen Pop clients is if I want to do an entire workout, first off, I realize if I'm trying to do all this in an hour, like that really limits the amount of time I have to spend on certain physical qualities. Okay, so let's say somebody's 40 plus, the warm up alone might be 10 or 15 minutes, right? So if we're taking an hour, there's like 25% of our session gone. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but we need that time to unlock mobility, get their tissues warm, just get them moving and feeling good. Well, now I'm just thinking in time chunks, right? So if R1 to R3 is 15 minutes, maybe that gives me 5-ish minutes to work on speed and power. So maybe I choose 1 or 2 exercises. Then I'm going to get into my strength work. And again, for me, in that environment, if somebody's coming to see me, that's probably the main entree, right? So that's going to be 25 to 30 minutes. Well, now that's like 50 minutes of my session. Maybe the last 10 is our metabolic work or our conditioning. And so that's where I'll do like my explosive repeats. Maybe I'll do some tempo or oxidative lifting. And then the recovery stuff they can go do on their own for a couple minutes when they're done, right? They don't need my assistance for that. But that's how I tend to do it. I tend to think of things in chunks, like time chunks, versus, hey, I need to do 3 sets of 8 or 3 sets of 10. If you think more in time chunks, it's going to help you lay out and set up that program more effectively. Last but not least, when we're talking about periodization, what I tend to do, and again, I'm not saying everybody needs to do this, but what I tend to do is rotate emphasis over the course of the year. Shout out to Olipop. Man, these things are amazing. Okay. So when I'm thinking about rotating my emphasis over the course of the year, when I ran my RTS annual program, which I will probably bring back next year in a different format, but there is a rotating emphasis over the course of the year. So if you're a power lifter, right, you got one emphasis, it's strength, and you just chase strength year round. But I find most of my Gen Pop clients are not interested in that. They're not trying to be power lifters. So what we'll generally do, unless they have another goal like being a boss level beach tennis player or pickleball player, is I will rotate their emphasis over the course of the year. So maybe the first 3 months we're focused on mobility, movement quality, just making sure their body feels really good. And then maybe the next 3 months, so April, May, June, getting ready for summer, right? You know, obviously you're in tank tops or you're shirtless or you're in a swimsuit. So a lot of times that's where we'll chase body comp changes. Hey, let's lock the nutrition in. Let's do more high volume training, incomplete rest. Like let's try and get as lean as we can and make sure that that's in a good place. Then July, August, September, then we'll lock in on some athleticism, right? It's nice out. Maybe you just naturally want to move more. Maybe you want to do some tempo runs or play a little bit more tennis or pickleball, whatever the case may be. So we're going to chase some athleticism. And in the final block, October, November, December, we might chase strength and just force development because it's getting colder. You know, you don't want to do as much stuff outside. You know, food is plentiful. So maybe that's, a time when we're going to put a little bit more emphasis on strength. So that's how I'll rotate it. Another way to think about it is if you have people that just 100%, they're locked in on aesthetics. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll just vacillate between an accumulation block, so a higher volume training block, and then an intensification block where it's a little bit more strength focused. So if we're throwing like set rep schemes out, we're talking about maybe like a 3x10-ish phase or 3x8, 3x10, 3x12, somewhere in there for our accumulation block. And then when we go to strength, maybe we're doing more 5x5, 4x6, 6x4. So we're chasing a little bit more neurological adaptation. So I think when you ping pong between those two, you get a really nice blend. So that's how I think about that. And then last but not least, Nils was asking about strength. And this is a super cop-out answer, Nils, but I think it'll hopefully resonate with you. I want my Gen Pop clients and people over 40 to be strong enough to move well without sacrificing mobility in the process. So let's talk about what we used to see back in the day, right? And it's kind of an old wives' tale, but it's really not when you think about it. What people used to say is, well, you lift heavy weights and you lose mobility, or you get less flexible, you get stiff, right? And not necessarily true if you do it the right way, but think about how most people used to do it, right? They'd lift heavy weights. And so when you lift heavy weights, naturally, you don't go through a full range of motion, right? You start to cut your range a little bit. Well, then what happens? Well, then you hit a certain weight, so you got to use more weight, right? You want to keep getting stronger. So what happens? Well, now you're using even less range of motion. So it's like this vicious cycle, right? Where you keep using more and more weight, you're creating more and more compression, you're going through a shorter and shorter range. So ultimately, I find a lot of my Gen Pop clients, they don't like that. Right. And now, luckily, I was smart enough. I don't think I did a lot of this. We never got so focused on the weights where we lost sight of movement quality. So I think instead of chasing like a certain target weight, my thought process goes more like this. It's like phase 1 with a Gen Pop client, unlock mobility, right? And probably shift center of gravity back. Because if you shift center of gravity back, mobility naturally comes in most cases. So you unlock mobility. Now, once you've unlocked mobility, now you choose exercises that reinforce said mobility. So the example I always use is, hey, I'm going to unlock you, but I don't want to then put you in a barbell back squat and shift you forward again and rob you of all the mobility we just got back, right? So, hey, we're going to do some mobility-based work, shift your center of gravity back. Now we're going to do a front squat or a 2 kettlebell front squat, which naturally shifts you back. And now we're going to go through the full range of motion that you have, right? So it's instead of a vicious negative cycle, it's an upward cycle, right? You unlock the body. You work through You choose the right exercise. You work through a full range of motion, which allows you to unlock mobility further. So that's kind of the way that I think about it and approach it. I'm not so focused on being super strong per se, but I want to get strong in foundational exercises, right? Like if I've got a Gen Pop client, I would love for them to have a really clean 2 kettlebell front squat. I'd love for them to have a really clean trap bar deadlift, but I'm never chasing those lifts to a point where I'm sacrificing their movement quality or their mobility. So, gentlemen, those were great questions. Matthew, Alessandro, Nils, great questions, and I hope those answers helped. Next, we have Michael. Michael says, let's say you have a client doing foam roller squats against the wall to alleviate tension and pressure in the knees and also teach them how to squat better. How or when do you know when to progress to maybe an elevated heel squat or another variation? And are there any key movements or cues that you look for? So first off, this roller supported hack squat is a great foundational exercise. I really like it. If nothing else, it teaches clients and athletes to feel their heels. And again, your heels are your brakes. So it helps them find their heels. It gets them in this position where their torso is really far back behind their feet. So it's a little bit more of a braking focused activity. So if you want like a general rule, I'd say if somebody's never really been in a gym before, maybe 6 to 8 weeks is a great place to kind of get them started, build some general tissue capacity, unload the knees so they maybe don't have some of those issues. If somebody's been doing this for a while, it may be only like 4 to 6 weeks, right? It might be faster if they got some weight room experience. But here's what I would suggest instead, Michael. Instead of just going from like roller supported hack squat into, let's say, a heels elevated goblet squat, what if while you're doing this roller supported hack squat, you're supersetting that with another activity that starts to build that pattern? So I'll drop some videos in here, but maybe it's a PVC ISO squat, right? Or a suspension trainer ISO squat, or a low cable ISO squat. A lot of these isometric activities can start to prep your clients and your athletes for the positions you want them to be able to get into. But since it's isometric, you can kind of mold them and shape them and help them feel the right things. Like, hey, do you feel your heels? Hey, do you feel this expansion front to back through your chest walls? Do you feel your quads burning, right? So you can kind of reinforce some of the things that they're going to need to learn. So that's kind of the way I like to approach it, is I'm always thinking like a half cycle or a cycle ahead. So, hey, if I want somebody to be able to squat really well in the next block, what are some things I can do in this block to start to lay that foundation? So, Michael, hope that helps. That's just a simple thing that I do that's worked really well with my clients and athletes. Next, we have Miko. Miko wants to know how you would program the pre-designed training plans from the Complete Coach Cert for the long term. So shout out to Miko. Thanks for letting me plug the cert. If you are a trainer or coach that's trying to level up, whether it's assessments, program design, coaching and cueing, progressions and regressions, if you are struggling as a coach, just pick up the cert. I guarantee it'll help. Okay, so when you buy the cert, you also get, I think it's 15, maybe it's as many as 17 training programs that you can literally take and swipe and deploy. Like all you have to do is fill in a couple pieces for each workout. You maybe put your own logo on there. Don't use my logo. That would be weird. Put your own logo on there and then you're good to go. But I have different programs there, right? Like fat loss is easy. Whenever I'm running fat loss programs, I literally just cycle through different set rep schemes. Let's be honest here. Fat loss is like 90% nutrition. So the set rep schemes, as long as they are working hard, they're working at an appropriate intensity, you are keeping them healthy, I don't think you need to think too much about that. Hypertrophy or muscle building, we did kind of already talk about this. When somebody's chasing aesthetics, I like to cycle back and forth between higher volume training blocks and lower volume, higher intensity training blocks. And so vacillating between those two, I think works really well. Now, when we're talking about athleticism, this is where I'll generally rotate through 3 different types of blocks. And I don't actually have these in the cert, Miko, but this will help you kind of understand my thought process. Generally, if I have enough time, I will cycle an athlete through 3 training blocks. The first is an accumulation training block. And the goal there is to shift center of gravity back, get rid of aches and pains, rebuild connective tissues, and just make sure their movement quality is on point. The second block, we're trying to maintain the movement that we built in the first one, but now we're chasing some outputs, right? So maybe that's strength. Maybe that's a vertical jump. Maybe that's braking. So that's where we'll shift our emphasis. In the final phase, where we're getting to the realization block, now we're thinking speed, we're thinking power. If necessary, we're thinking specific conditioning and really like tissue specific conditioning. But if I'm training an athlete, generally those are the three training blocks or the three training blocks that I'll cycle somebody through to get them from start of the off season to preseason or training camp ready. And then the final thought here is if you're training a Gen Pop client and they don't really have a goal, this is where I rotate the goals for them. So maybe you do a couple blocks of more mobility focused stuff, and then you do a couple blocks of body comp stuff, right? Trying to lean them out. And then maybe you want to do some strength stuff for a little while, and then you do some hypertrophy. There's really no right or wrong answer there. It's just you kind of connecting the dots or just like kind of sequencing the training programs in a way that makes sense to you or the clients that you're working with. So I hope that helps, dude. If you have a follow-up there, or if I was not great in that answer, definitely let me know. Okay, hitting the home stretch. Next, we have Craig. Craig says, I'm curious, what is your thought process in regards to selecting loads for exercises, such as offset step-ups, campo deadlifts, kickstand RDLs, ipsilateral, contralateral loaded split squats, etc.? In other words, you have some guidelines you use. Also, what kind of load progression do you use for these same types of exercises? I don't imagine you are trying to push loading session to session on these movements too much, or maybe you are. I would imagine that at a certain percentage of body weight, you would reach an upper limit for being able to load these types of movements. And then he talks about this post from Ryan Patrick, who is one of my guys and who I have a ton of respect for. So I'll put Ryan Patrick's IG post in the show notes because that'll maybe give you some insight here. But basically, Craig, first off, it's great to hear from you, dude. I hope you're doing well. And I agree really strongly with Ryan on this topic. When I am thinking of training, I think of it as a bell curve, right? And it works for R1, 2, 3, R4, R5, R6, R7. Like that bell curve works. But I think it works here as well, too, in the sense of greatest potential for loading. And here's what I mean by that, right? You choose the exercises at the top of a workout, right? Whether it's our speed, our power, our explosiveness, our strength, the things that require the most neural output, there's a reason we do those first, right? Because we want to do those when we're fresh. And so it only makes sense as we fatigue, right? So when we get into some of these, accessory or supplemental type exercises, we just don't have as much juice in the tank. But I think there's a different way to think about this. And so I've thought quite a bit about this over the last couple months and the last couple years. But here's how I think about it, right? When we start a workout, we're doing our big bang bilateral lifts, our high CNS activities. So our explosive sprinting, our running, our jumping, our cutting, those things are chasing outputs, right? And so if outputs are the primary thing, and they are the thing for most of us, right? Like if your goal is to chase outputs to perform at a certain level, you got to put those in there. Now, when we get into the supplemental stuff, right? And that's generally the exercise you're talking about, whether it's a step up, a staggered stance deadlift, a split squat, those types of things. I'm thinking there's a totally different reason for doing that, right? Rarely is it strength or power or output focused. Instead, I'm thinking about filling in movement gaps. So maybe somebody doesn't rotate particularly well. Maybe they're getting spun from left to right, and I want to get them back onto their left side. Maybe they've lost some rotation. Or maybe I'm just trying to enhance some sort of movement-related goal, right? So maybe we're doing something like a lateral lunge or a lateral split squat because I know that'll carry over to an athlete's lateral shuffle. So when I'm thinking about these supplemental exercises, I'm not really chasing loads in most cases. And if I am, it is very much that Goldilocks load where, hey, it's enough load to help them move well, but it's not so much load to where we see all these different compensations, right? So let's take something super basic like a split squat. When somebody's doing a split squat, we want them kind of in that 90-90 position, right? We would like the knee, the hip, and the shoulder all stacked. When they push out of that lunge, we want them to be able to maintain that same position. We don't want the torso collapsing forward, or we don't want them arching really hard through the back. I think that's a great litmus test for, hey, can they maintain their movement quality with this specific load, right? And so that's where I just call it the Goldilocks weight, right? Too little, you're not really getting much out of the exercise, but too much, and now you're basically cheating the movement and you're creating compensations that you're trying to improve or you're trying to get rid of. And then finally, you just got like your accessory and isolative stuff. And this could just be to like clean up asymmetries, general bulletproofing. So if you're doing isolation, cuff work, quad work, calf work, Achilles work, that sort of thing, that's probably where that's going to go in at the very end, because neurologically not taxing. It's the lowest level stuff. Generally, you're using external support in some way, right? Like if you're doing a machine leg extension, there's external support. It's super isolated and targeted, so it's very easy to deal with. Now, with all that being said, there is one exception to this rule. And I will say this because I was a power lifter. I know you power lifted as well. I do think there's a time and a place, especially in an off season for power lifters, where you want to make some of the assistant stuff a little bit more of a focus. And maybe it's not these particular exercises, right? Like a step up, an offset deadlift, a split squat. Maybe it's not those exercises, but maybe it's not the main lift. So think about this. Let's say you have a power lifter, strong triceps, right? So when they miss a lift, if they can get it off their chest and they can get it to the sticking point, they're blasting through because their triceps are strong enough. So in this case, the weakness is the chest, right? Or the bottom position. So maybe for a certain period of time, like coming out of a meet, I'm not going to focus on the pure barbell bench press. Maybe we're going to do paused dumbbell stuff. Maybe we're going to use some form of cambered bar where they can go through an exaggerated range of motion, right? So it's not some of these types of activities, but maybe I am going to chase very targeted activities that will either focus on a specific muscle group or a specific range of motion of the lift. And this was something that I absolutely loved about powerlifting. I mean, I remember Eric Cressy and I used to just nerd out on this stuff, and we'd go back and forth, and we had all these exercise menus like, oh, if somebody's a conventional deadlifter and they miss off the ground, here are like 5 exercises. Like that was so much fun to me because it was like constantly trying to reverse engineer the lifts and find the best accessory exercises to eliminate those weaknesses. So Craig, I hope that helps you out a little bit. Just to summarize, I don't put a huge emphasis on specific loads. I need enough load to where we're getting the training adaptation that we want, but not so heavy to get to a point where form technique would break down and we'd start to see compensations, which is generally what we're trying to work around or fix anyway. Okay, I think we have one more here. Man, this is a doozy. Okay, so John wants to know, he says, I've been a trainer for 12 years now and have followed you most of that time and enjoyed a lot of what I've learned from you and applied some of your philosophy, like coaching movements, not weight. John, smart move, man. Smart move. Now, he goes on to say, I have quite a few certs under my belt from those years too. My question is, what was a good practice that helped you best stay focused on your clients when other coaches or trainers around you don't coach good movements? He says his head trainer isn't any better. It just seems like I'm the only one who really wants to be better at coaching the overall client and movements, not just being a trainer or rep counter, LOL. Okay, so John, I'm going to have a little bit harder time relating to this, and that's only because I just created my own environment. If I was unhappy with how people did things, I left that place and eventually started my own place, which is our own little version of utopia. So I always joke around like the people at iFast are at iFast because they're savages. Even our interns, like they were there because they saw the value of what we were doing. So from that lens or that perspective, I can't help you out as much, but I do have some ideas for you. So I'm not just going to leave you hanging. Your first goal, and this is going to be very, very important, you've got to get in better rooms. So if you are in an environment where, I don't know how many coaches you're around, but especially if it's a top-down thing, where everybody's just focused on work super hard, add more weight, get strong. Like if that's the mantra and there's no emphasis on moving better, right? I'm never going to tell you that getting strong or more powerful or in better shape is a bad thing. But I do think when it becomes, when it gets to a point where you're sacrificing movement quality and long-term health, that's problematic. Okay. So your first goal is to get in better rooms. The first thing I would say is, I don't know where you're at, but if you are in a metropolitan area, I would actively seek out other trainers and coaches, maybe at other gyms that you can network with. Go do a training session with them. Create a group that goes and has coffee. Find stuff or find other people that will help you stay switched on, right? So getting in better rooms means, finding other trainers and coaches maybe in your area. It could be attending a seminar. That was one of the great things that I'm always reminded by when Joel and I did our workshop in Vegas. Just being around other motivated trainers and coaches, like you can see it in the room because there's like a buzz and all these trainers, they're talking to each other and they're sharing stories and, oh, I'm doing this and this is working great. But it helps for the presenters too, because now I'm switched on because I'm like, hey man, there really are high level trainers and coaches that want to get better. It's not just yahoos coming up with 30 pinky toe exercises that you can do on IG, right? Like nobody cares about that. So maybe it's attending a course or attending a seminar. But I think at the end of the day, John, what you have to do, you have to find high level people to surround yourself with and to stay engaged with. Because if you don't, and you end up in this little like cesspool or this swamp of people that aren't motivated, that aren't trying to get better, eventually you're going to feel the brunt of that, right? Like you're going to get burned out. You're going to get annoyed. You're just going to get this feeling of being stuck. And that's why I recorded last week's podcast, because I think there are a lot of trainers and coaches out there that just feel stuck. And a lot of that could be alleviated if you try and change your environment. And so that's been one great thing for me showing up at iFast for 16 and a half years now. I don't ever feel burned out. I don't feel stuck. Or if it does, it's very few and far between. And it's generally something that I've done that I need to fix, right? Like I show up and I'm surrounded by other trainers, other coaches, the one and only Bill Hartman. I'm surrounded by people that are switched on and that want to get better. And so that would be my best advice to you, is find ways to interact with and engage with other high-level trainers and coaches. Who knows, man? Maybe you end up finding a better spot to work out of. Or, they know somebody that's opening a gym and you can go there, and all of a sudden, now it's not just like a once a week thing where you're hanging out with a different group. Now it's every day you show up to work and you're surrounded by high-level trainers and coaches. So guys, that does it for this week's episode. Man, there was a lot of ground covered. Hopefully you don't get bored with my incessant rambling. But man, I just get excited about this stuff. These were such great questions. And if you guys enjoy these types of shows where it's a Q&A, open format, I'm happy to do this. I don't think once a month is appropriate. I think that's probably too soon. But maybe every 8-ish weeks, 8 to 12 weeks, I'm happy to do one of these where I can answer or help problem solve the questions that you're struggling with. So small favor to ask, if you enjoyed today's show, number one, if you're not subscribed, do that right now. iTunes or Apple Music, whatever it's called now, Spotify, YouTube podcasts, go there, subscribe so you know each and every week when a new episode drops. If you're already subscribed, thank you. I appreciate it. Go one step further. If I answered a question that was helpful to you, or maybe a fellow trainer, coach, physical therapist, somebody that's struggling with in-season programming, maybe they're struggling with their Gen Pop clients, or maybe they're frustrated and burned out and they don't have a great support group around them, please share this episode with them. I'm here for you guys. The podcast is very much a labor of love. I love doing it, and I love giving back to people like you. So if you found benefit in this and somebody else who would benefit, if you would just share it with them, I would truly appreciate it. So my friend, as always, thank you so much for your support. Love and appreciate you. And we'll be back next week with our next episode. Take care.